Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to IISS Americas. We're the Washington office of the international think tank, the International Institute for Strategic Studies. It's our pleasure to have the live audience in the room this morning and our online audience tuning in from around the globe. This morning's discussion is an opportunity to address the four ambassadors who represent the nations that were invited by NATO to the Madrid Summit this past summer. This should be a really interesting discussion, and our moderator Heino Klinck will take you through that here in just a moment. I would remind you that if you're interested, you can tune into the IISS Manama dialogue that will be taking place in Bahrain starting Friday, and we are thrilled to have everybody here in the room with us and look forward to welcoming you to our future events. So with that, Heino, I turn it over to you to introduce everybody and get us started.
Thank you very much, EJ, and thank you very much to the audience here that joined us in person in Washington and to the 140 some odd people online. But most importantly, I would like to thank Your Excellencies for making the time to be with us today. Just the mere fact that we were able to synchronize so many calendars, I think, is a strategic achievement in and of itself. So I appreciate, again, your availability and your staff and working with us to make this this event happen. In late June, the 29th and 30th of June, the Madrid Summit was held. Truly a historic event for a number of reasons. For one, the heads of government from Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea were invited for the very first time, and that's obviously why we're all here today. Additionally, the fact that the strategic context of a war raging in Europe was also very historic, and then I would say equally the fact that the new NATO strategic concept was unveiled, which directly addressed the China challenge, something that affects not just NATO, of course, but our friends and allies in the Indo-Pacific. When I was in government several years ago, was privileged to work with the ministries of defense of all four of these allies and partners. And I will tell you that was frankly one of the professional highlights when I was in that role. And I know that the collaboration and cooperation between our five countries has only grown. Certainly within the last 150 days or so since the NATO summit, there have been a lot of things that have happened on the international stage, which again provide some interesting backdrop for today's conversation, that including the PLA aggression in Taiwan after Speaker Pelosi's visit, a renewed provocation cycle from North Korea, both towards South Korea as well as Japan with missile firings, and of course also, again, the war raging in Europe. And then very recently, as a matter of fact, ongoing today, still the G20 meeting and the summit between President Biden and General Secretary Xi. And we're all still waiting to get a very fulsome readout of that. So this, again, is the backdrop for today's conversation. So I will not provide introductions of the ambassadors present here because their service to their nations is extensive. You've seen all of their backgrounds before and have seen the work that they've done, not just to further bilateral relations between their countries and the United States, but also multilaterally as well. But just to orient everyone, to my right is Ambassador Sinodinos from Australia. And we have Ambassador Koji from Japan, and then to my left, Ambassador Corry from New Zealand, and further to my left, Ambassador Cho from the Republic of Korea. So what I'd like to do at this point is turn it over to the Australian ambassador to start us off with some opening remarks, please. Sir?
Yeah, I guess we start with Australia because we start with A. Look, it's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you to the International Institute for Strategic Studies and to you, Heino, for this invitation. Look, if you'd said to me a few years ago that, we'd have a major land war in Europe, the first since the Second World War, I would have said, how is that even possible? And I think that has been a moment of great clarity for many countries, particularly in the West. We've seen the way in which I think it's revitalized NATO. We've seen the way in which it's, Russia has, this is a great achievement of Russia's. It's doubled the border between NATO and Russia now with the advent of Sweden and Finland and whatever. So this year we've sort of found ourselves tipped into a new world, which we didn't think we were going to face. I think the Biden administration, when they came into office, thought that issues to do with Russia were in a certain box, and they would have a stability dialogue or whatever they were going to call it, and that was fine. And they would then turn, and their focus would be all on the Indo-Pacific and the geostrategic issues arising in the Indo-Pacific from the rise of China, and how to accommodate the rise of China in the global rules-based order. But what Russia has done by flagrantly invading a smaller neighbor is try and turn the global rules-based order on its head. And this cannot stand. I mean, this is a flagrant breach of the UN Charter. And so for many countries, clearly, first and foremost in Europe, but in the Indo-Pacific, democratic countries like the ones represented here, this was a major challenge that could not go unmet. And so for countries like Australia, there is a lot at stake of what happens in Europe. And so the fact that the P4 were part of the summit, the NATO summit this year, was an expression of that interlinkage in terms of the global rules-based order and how we have to work together to maintain that order. Yes, over time, we have to accommodate rising players, but it has to be in a context where people accept similar rules of the game. That's the challenge we face. And so for us, increasing the cooperation we have with NATO, with our allies and partners in the region, has become number one business for us, a high priority. There's a new Australian government, but there's a lot of also continuity in the approach of the new Australian government on these issues. And that is around how we address geostrategic challenges in our own region, how we do that militarily, how we do that with all the other elements of statecraft. But integral to that is what we also contribute in terms of the broader efforts. So Australia is one of the biggest non-NATO contributors to the efforts in Russia and Ukraine, and that will continue. And obviously, until there is some sort of settlement, our view is that there has to be a strong and unified response. NATO itself has reoriented its focus, has talked more about the issues in the Indo-Pacific and how they impact as it sees on its core mission. And let's not forget what the core mission is. The core mission is a group of like-minded countries, essentially liberal democracies, coming together to, if you like, preserve and adapt the global rules-based order, which has underwritten our peace and prosperity since World War II. And so from our perspective, the cooperation with NATO is very integral to that task. There are going to be all sorts of other questions, no doubt you want to raise, but I just want to leave it with there, but make no mistake, Australia stands very strongly with Ukraine. We stand very strongly with the countries of NATO in addressing these issues.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Koji.
Oh, thank you. Well, I start by thanking IIS for inviting me to this very timely event. And in my career, I spent 7 years altogether in London. I visit many times Temple Place, the headquarters, and remember doing some events moderated by Mark Fitzpatrick over there. So great to see you back. And I was EJ was among my guests for the reception I hosted, commemorating the foundation of self-defense forces a couple of weeks ago. So it's thank you very much for reciprocating my invitation so soon. But on that occasion, I made a short speech describing the evolving role played by our self-defense forces, and there, I underline the growing importance of the collaboration taking place, not just with our traditional ally, the United States, but other partners. And the growing ties with the NATO is a key aspect of this evolution. So it's great to have this opportunity to share my thoughts with you today. And perhaps I shouldn't spend too much time, explaining why this new partnership is becoming important. I think Arthur made a very eloquent case. But simply put, I think there is a growing awareness that our security is indivisible. And I think in this respect, I commend IISS, raising this awareness over the years, events like Manama Dialogue, Shangri-La Dialogue, linking various partners. But all the challenges we face today, no boundaries, climate change, pandemic, cyber attack, so on and so forth. And on top of that, as Arthur alluded, there has been serious challenge to the rule-based national order. And that's an event that reminding us this indivisibility of our security. That's the reason why the four of us are working shoulder to shoulder with the European partners to help, the brave people in Ukraine restore their independence and freedom. And the other factor I'd like to mention is what's happening in the Pacific region, the evolution of security architecture. Traditionally, the security architecture in the Pacific has been the one based on the hub and spokes, hub being the United States and spokes being the set of bilateral security arrangement. But now we are starting to see this structure evolving into a sort of network with each player, each member playing a more proactive role. And this has led, the various bilateral, trilateral, plurilateral collaboration among the partners in the Pacific, but also it opened up new avenues for all the members working with the European partners. So there, you started to see a number of exercises, training taking place involving Indo-Pacific as well as European partners. So we look forward to deepening this trend. And the final point I'd like to make before I finish is what has underpinned all the developments I described is a US readiness to engage the allies and partners. And I commend the Biden administration for maintaining this posture as was confirmed by the new national security strategy. So I stop here.
Thank you very much, sir. Professor Corry, floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Heino. Thanks to you, thanks to the IISS for convening this this very important seminar. As a recent arrival from London, where I was New Zealand High Commissioner, I also want to commend the great work the IISS does around the world. Having attended your Shangri-La dialogues, for example, is a great insight into your reach and the great quality of the audiences you command and the great work that you do. I also want to briefly acknowledge my colleagues on the panel and the countries that they represent. Australia, New Zealand's ally and closest friend, Japan and the Republic of Korea, both very close and like-minded regional partners with which we are working increasingly closely for the reasons my two colleagues have already described, and principally for the reason that we all share very significant interests in a secure, open and prosperous Indo-Pacific. In my very brief comments this morning, I want to talk really about two principal things. One, New Zealand and NATO, and two, the AP4 event itself in Madrid back in June. To start with that, and then I'll return to it later, just to note how much we welcome the invitation to join our close regional friends at the summit in Madrid in June, along with obviously NATO and its European partners. That was a great opportunity for our Prime Minister to underscore the importance we attach to the cross-cutting security issues of the day and to underline the things that we see as important in the world. Clearly, a really important opportunity to take stock of the enormous challenge faced by or posed by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has both undermined peace and stability and the global rules-based order on which our four countries each depend. And our own response to that invasion, and there were further announcements on that this week, I think reflects our unequivocal condemnation of Russia's actions and the gravity with which we view their consequences. So cooperating with partners with shared values and interests, such as those on this table today, and of course our NATO allies, is a really important part of strengthening our resilience and reinforcing the security of our region. And this kind of cooperation, as my two colleagues have already said, really reflects the global consequences of regional security challenges. And that's evidenced by a far-off country like New Zealand contributing to the defense of Ukraine. And it's reflected in, of course, NATO's interest in the Indo-Pacific. Turning to the nature of our cooperation with NATO as NATO, leaving aside for the moment its Indo-Pacific vocation, that's focused on practical things like enhancing interoperability, but it's also about contributing to global peace and security, promoting democratic values and norms, and improving our joint ability to respond to challenges. And it goes back quite a bit further than many people might realize. We first deployed on NATO operations in 1996 as part of the stabilization force in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Our 20-year deployment to Afghanistan began in 2001 as part of NATO's ISAF. At a very practical level, much of our defense force equipment is built to NATO standards and doctrine, and reflects, the doctrine, training, tactics, and procedures. They're all influenced by NATO practice. Turning to the AP4 construct in Madrid, a really valuable opportunity, as others have said, for a wide-ranging exchange of views. Our presence there was testimony to the fact that we welcome NATO's focus on strengthening engagement and cooperation with its Asia-Pacific partners. And as the Prime Minister said to leaders at the summit, strategic disruption is not confined to the consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Significant, obviously, those are. She said, in our own neighborhood, we see the mounting pressure on the international rules-based order. We see attempts to disrupt and destabilize. Separately, China has in recent times also become more assertive and more willing to challenge international rules and norms. The meeting highlighted some important priorities that we share: cooperation on cyber issues, on new technologies, on maritime security and climate change. These all align very strongly with New Zealand's own strategic priorities and interests. They were reflected in our 2021 defence assessment, which singled out strategic competition and climate change as two of the biggest security challenges that we face. And as the Prime Minister said at the summit, the primary security concern of Pacific Island countries in our immediate region is climate change, where sea level rise and more frequent natural disasters are already a reality. In terms of the AP4 construct itself, the Prime Minister said in Madrid, we're not seeking, as it were, to expand our military alliances through a new formal architecture. While we have many interests in common, each of the AP4 partners will have its own priorities for engagement with NATO, and established bilateral mechanisms for enhanced cooperation with NATO obviously remain our primary channel. But clearly, the new AP4 format is a new means for dialogue with NATO on matters of mutual interest. Finally, at the summit, and I think it's important to remember that as we think about the challenge in the Indo-Pacific, we can't solely securitize them. In other words, security cooperation is not the only solution. We do need to be thinking about other modes of engagement with the region, notably, of course, through diplomacy, but also through other important things, such as strengthening regional economic architecture, on which note I will end. Thanks very much, Heino.
Thank you, sir. Ambassador Cho, please.
Well, very pleased to meet you all this morning, and thank the IISS for organizing this very unique first gathering. I suspect that this kind of gathering, AP4, at the ambassador's level or other levels, will continue in other parts of the world, I think, because as my good friend, Japanese Ambassador Tomita-san said, the security is increasingly indivisible. When we said security is indivisible, that was kind of academic maxim some time ago. But looking at what's happening in Ukraine, many of the peoples in the Indo-Pacific region now believe and appreciate that actually this is very close to our homelands and very close to us ourselves. So we'll have to use this opportunity to rethink about the concept of the security, the emerging challenges, what kind of policies we have to pursue to meet those challenges. So in short, I'm very pleased to be here. I can echo many of the things that were said by my good friends and colleagues from Australia, Japan, and New Zealand. And yes, what happened in Ukraine had very important implications to my country and to our region as well, both in terms of security implications, for example. So what kind of lessons North Korea will learn from Russia's experience in Ukraine, especially in the possibility of threatening the use of nuclear weapons. So if the international community doesn't cope with this very well, I think it will have a very negative implications on North Korea too, and that's a direct security challenge to my country. And of course, economic implications out of Ukraine, also affecting my country and others in our region, especially in energy sector. Everybody is affected by this. So that actually reawakens the understanding that we'll have to pay attention to what's happening in Europe and what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. And this is very important for Korea and other countries of the region. Looking back, the Korea's connection with NATO go back to 2006, when it became a partner member or partner of the NATO. And what happened? We attended many meetings. We were part of the conversations and all that. All in all, it's very good, positive experiences. But I can share with you that actually Korea became a little more proactive from time to time, including in our participation in bringing peace to Afghanistan, for example. We were part of the provincial reconstruction team that was organized by NATO. And also our naval vessel is still off the Horn of Africa, joining the NATO-led efforts to make sure that pirates would not run wild there. So a very challenging proposition, but it's important that Korea, not long ago, was so confined to the peninsula, is actually reaching out and be active. And overseas, like the seas of the Horn of Africa, very far away from my country, and being part of the efforts led by NATO. I think it's two good examples. But I think time has come for all of us, including Korea, to have a closer institutional kind of conversation network with NATO, because the challenges, many of them turn out to be a common challenge for all of us. And what's happening in the Pacific, of course, will affect the countries in NATO and Europe and vice versa. So Korea was very glad to be part of the AP4 summit that was held at the initiatives of Japan. I thank Japan for that. And also on the margins of the NATO summit in Madrid in June. And as a matter of fact, that was the first time that leader of my country actually participated in NATO summit. So this is a first for Korea. Actually, there are a number of firsts for Korea for the last 6 or 7 months after the new government in Korea took office, because the new government in Korea has different priorities, different outlooks, different threat perceptions, and different emphasis in policies. And many of them sit very well with the priorities by our host nation, United States. And many of these actually are consistent with those pursued by our partners sitting on this desk together this morning. So Korea is interested and Korea is willing to be a part of the active kind of networks to provide and produce some tangible and meaningful kind of the outcomes that can come out of this gathering. It can be on a economic security area, for example. Korea can have contribution to make in terms of a supply chains, resilient supply chains, semiconductors, emerging technologies, critical mines, health security, climate change, and all these areas. I think Korea can make some contribution, and we are happy to do that. And also in terms of security, especially in the Indo-Pacific region, Korea is willing to explore the possibilities of greater cooperation in there. Say, for example, we have been involved in capacity building efforts by some maritime countries in the Pacific. I think these efforts will continue and probably strengthen. And having conversations about these common endeavor will be very important for pursuing Korea's policies and determining the directions of the policy we are going to pursue. And lastly, I'd like to share with you that actually my president is in Bali, having just finished meeting with Xi Jinping. And before that, in Phnom Penh, my president had meetings with President Biden and Prime Minister Kishida. And we had also a trilateral summit meeting in Japan, US, and ROK. And this is also should be a matter of fact and matter of course, but it was not, because some of the meetings were not held for the last 4 years or so. So we are reviving this cooperation, and we are very happy about it. In the same spirit, the Yoon Suk-yeol government produced our own Indo-Pacific strategy, and that's also first for Korea. When you publish your strategy, of course, some nations will like it, but there are probably others who wouldn't like it very much. So we are taking risks and publishing this strategy report, and I hope that all these efforts pursued by the new government in Korea will be widely shared and understood by a very important people gathered here this morning. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And gentlemen, thank you for a great start to the discussion by really setting a solid foundation that runs across the spectrum of our common national security interests, as well as our common values, quite frankly, that bind us together, regardless of the geographic distances between each one of us, as well as between Asia Pacific and NATO as a whole. What I'd like to do now is pose 2 questions that I would ask each of you to answer. We'll go again, the burden of the alphabet remains. So if I may, so NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg emphasized that NATO will step up cooperation with Asia Pacific partners to address serious challenges that the People's Republic of China represents, including in cooperation in cyber defense, new technologies, maritime security, climate change, as well as countering disinformation. With that backdrop, my 2 questions to you gentlemen are, number 1, what are the most critical areas for cooperation for your government? And number 2, among these topics, are any of them problematic for your government in its approach to the challenges that China poses? Sir.
Thanks very much, Heino. Look, on the first part of the question, the easy thing to say is that they're all important, and that's why they're all there. If you look at issues around cyber, for example, clearly in what we now call the forum of grey zone activities, cyber is first and foremost become very important, and therefore cooperation among allies and partners in countering some of the issues that are happening in that sort of grey zone is becoming increasingly important. And the reality is that countries cannot deal with some of those sorts of issues alone. And so increasingly, we've been cooperating around issues of not just cyber defenses, but ransomware initiatives and how we take a common approach to all of that. How do we isolate those state and non-state players who are doing this? I mean, I think cyber remains very much at the forefront of all of this. Counter-terrorism remains important. We can't take our eye off the ball in some parts of the world. Climate change has to be in there because it's something that impacts on all of us. And there are many avenues of cooperation, and the new Australian government has made it clear that it's taking a more aggressive approach to dealing with climate change. And in fact, when our Prime Minister met the President straight after the election, when they were at the Quad Leaders meeting in Tokyo together, he indicated that he wanted to make climate change a third pillar of the alliance with the US. So for us, that remains important. So we regard climate change as something which is a whole of government priority, and therefore it suffuses all of the activities we undertake, including with our partners. I think in terms of areas like misinformation, disinformation, we're all pretty much aware of what's going on, right? And again, it's about identifying the common approaches, ways we can all just cooperate with each other. So I think all of those priorities are fine. On the second part of the question, any of this problematic in terms of our approach to China challenges? Well, we are in a process at the moment, and our Prime Minister has just met Xi Jinping to the margins of the G20 in Bali. We have been seeking to take some of the heat out of the relationship because we've been sort of in the doghouse, if I can put it like that, for the last few years. And there's been a deal of economic and trade coercion. So the new government felt it was important to take some of the temperature out of the relationship and try and find a process for dialogue, just as President Biden met Xi to try and sort of take some of the misunderstandings out of the relationship. It's the same with Australia, but this is done on the basis that we're not seeking to change our strategic or policy settings. It's being done on the basis that we want a more normal relationship with China. We want trade to be more normal again and all the rest of it. But we're doing this in a context where we're staying true to our values and interests. And our values and interests are reflected by the decisions we've taken by our participation in the Quad Leaders meeting, our involvement in the creation of AUKUS with the US and the UK, and it's reflected in the actions we're now taking in terms of our military buildup, which is going to become quite significant over the next few years. So we know what our strategic and policy settings are, but obviously we want fruitful relations with all countries, and that includes China. I mean, from our perspective, a strong and prosperous China is in everybody's interest. But the question here is about how do you accommodate the rise of such a great power in a way which is consistent with maintaining the essentials of the global rules-based order, rather than having that order upended. I mean, that is the challenge.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Koji.
Well, security cooperation between Japan and NATO has been conducted on the basis of the PREMA called Individual Partnership and Cooperation Program, IPCP, which was originally concluded in 2014, I believe, and updated twice since then. And there we identified the priority areas and which very much overlap with the those identified by Secretary Stoltenberg, like cyber defense, maritime security, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, arms control, and defense science, and so forth. I don't have time to comment each of these subjects. More broadly, I think as we try to pursue these priorities, we need to make progress in two areas. The first, I think we need to deepen policy dialogue. You know, the 4 leaders participating in Madrid is a groundbreaking event, and we are also trying to deepen our conversation at all levels. But still, there remains, you know, geographical distance, difference in terms of security outlook, threat perceptions, and the priorities. So I think we need to continue these efforts. The second area is there's this whole question of enabling environments. For instance, Japan has been working with major NATO partners like Germany, France, UK, trying to put in place, for instance, a legal frameworks in the areas of intelligence sharing, technology transfer, status of force, and so on and so forth. These enabling environments are going to be very important as we try to upgrade our defense cooperation. And interoperability is a key aspect of this effort. And in this context, I have been following with a great interest the conversation taking place between Japan and the UK for the possible joint development of fighter jets. And if that agreement comes through, this will be a very important event, in terms of efforts to improve interoperability. And is any of these activities discussed problematic vis-a-vis China? Well, I don't think so. Maybe Chinese friends may find it otherwise, but of course, these activities need to be implemented in a manner consistent with overall conduct of China policy. We may have a chance to come back to that later. But each of these activities serves a very important strategic purpose. So I don't think we should feel any reticence in pursuing these objectives.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Ambassador Corry, please.
Thanks, Heino. Excuse me. I think in looking at what Secretary General Stoltenberg had to say at the summit on this theme, in terms of those serious challenges that have been enumerated, as I read it, he wasn't solely delimiting those, as it were, to China, but he was identifying them as global challenges while noting, obviously, a China connection with them. So just to put that gloss on what was actually said, we would certainly see that list of issues as global challenges, many of them like climate change requiring global solutions. But as Arthur said, the easy thing to do, but also the right thing to do, is to see all of them as important. Cyber defense, technologies, maritime security, climate change, from countering disinformation, all matter a lot to us. Prime Minister said to leaders at the NATO summit, Russian disinformation operations are active in New Zealand. Another kind of data point going to this sense that global security challenges are these days truly global ones. On whether any of these domains are problematic for New Zealand in respect of China, I guess I'd echo the points already made in different ways, which is that when it comes to the defense or advancement of your national interests and values, whether or not this is problematic for another country, whoever it is in a sense a kind of second order issue. If you're dealing with something which is indeed an interest or a value, clearly an issue you need to take into account, but not necessarily the primary issue on the table. And so to look at the list we've been given on cyber issues, New Zealand has made attributed statements naming those whom we judge responsible. On maritime security, we have joined operations on the high seas with our security partners, including last year when the United Kingdom sent a carrier strike group, to the Indo-Pacific, where we sent a frigate and a tanker to join that. The Prime Minister, as I've said, has called out Russian dis and misinformation operations in New Zealand. The final point I'd make is that we shouldn't necessarily assume that all those domains, the issues identified by the Secretary General, are inherently problematic when it comes to other countries. Some of them are indeed zones for cooperation, and we would put climate change squarely in that camp when it came to China. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, sir. Ambassador Cho.
Yes. Well, cybersecurity, emerging technology, maritime security, climate change, and dealing with disinformation efforts. I believe all are important, but when it comes to Korea, we are actually facing a very critical security threat these days, in the form of North Korea's increasing nuclear and missile capability. And North Korea wasn't good at anything, but they were actually good at developing nuclear capability and developing missile capabilities. From 2019, they have developed, many of them successfully, in developing the precision-guided short-range missiles. They have already developed a longer-range missile capability. So that demonstrates North Korea's threat becoming a clear and present danger for all of us. So Korea is so focused upon this. So naturally, it wasn't mentioned by Heino, but the area of the arms control and non-proliferation, of course, naturally is we have a great interest in. So we have had 1 or 2 conversations with NATO about this area, and this will continue. I think we can make some contributions there. Also, the emerging technologies, since Korea is a player and a player in this area, including many like semiconductors and others. So we are interested in developing dialogue in this area with NATO. And as a matter of fact, there was 1 initial dialogue already happened, and we intend to develop this dialogue mechanism. We can probably make some contributions there. And also, we are also interested in climate change and maritime security. And these areas are important to Korea as well. And especially finally, cyber. Actually, the Korea and the United States have strengthened a cyber security collaboration in a very meaningful way this year. So I'm sure that this area can also be an area for cooperation between Korea and NATO countries, 84 countries for that matter. So the increasing cooperation in this context can be problematic for us in our relation with China. It depends. Depends on this. The Korean government believes that we have to have values and common values as an important part of our policies. We believe that the concept of mutual is important, mutual respect, be part of any relations we have with other countries. And we believe that rules-based international regional order is in Korea's interests. So we are going to pursue policies based upon these elements and others. If some countries find it problematic, then of course we have problems. But we are going to make efforts to manage and our relation with China. China is an important country, so we have no intention to downgrade our relation with China. We are going to we have every intention to develop our relation with China, but the basis, of course, is that the common values and the rules-based order and the common interest in mutual respect. And that is, I think, very, very important. And we realized it when we had our own experience with China on a not very good side back in 2015. And we realized that this is rather important and should stay there in the middle of the relationship Korea has with, as a matter of fact, with any country, including China.
Thank you very much, sir. Just to keep the conversation and the discussion going, what I'll do now is I'll ask 1 question to each ambassador, a little bit more tailored to each country. And after that, we'll open the floor up for questioning. So get your questions ready, both here in person as well as online. So Ambassador Sinodinos, if I may start with you yet again. Your country's in the midst of its defense strategic review. What thematic or explicit overlap do you anticipate it having with the NATO 2022 strategic concept?
Yeah, the new government announced a defense strategic review pretty soon after it came to office. And the purpose of that is to look at the structure of the armed forces, to look at the capability requirements, to determine whether we have the right emphasis in our capability. The Defence Minister, the Australian Defence Minister, made a speech overnight where he talked about our capacity to project power more into the region, and with greater lethality and force. A down payment on that is the decision that was made and announced last year to pursue AUKUS, the UK, Australia, and the US. Two pillars to AUKUS. The first pillar, pillar one, is submarines, nuclear powered submarines, a capability to project power into the region. We regard that as quite important, and there'll be announcements about the optimal pathway and about what the final design looks like in about March of next year. There will also be a number of interim steps to answer questions about how we fill the gap as we wait for this new capability to come on stream. The second pillar is advanced capabilities, and this involves areas like AI and machine learning, cyber, quantum, undersea warfare, hypersonics, electronic warfare, a number of areas where we want to develop more high technology approaches, and that would be done in consultations with the other partners in the trilateral context. That's an integral part of the Defence Strategic Review. So there'll be announcements about AUKUS and announcements about the outcome of the Defence Strategic Review about the same time early next year. And this will have implications, as I said, to the structure of the forces and also capability requirements. Australia has been increasing its military spending over the last few years. The view is that some of the trends that we've seen in the region are actually accelerating. They're happening more quickly than we previously thought. And so from our perspective, it's better for us to be prepared more quickly. In terms of overlap with what NATO is talking about in terms of strategic concept, both of them seek to address geostrategic challenges in the region. And the point of this is not to sort of arm or rearm for its own sake. It's to provide a message of deterrence and preparedness in consultation with other allies and partners. We think Australia, by developing its own capabilities, can be a stronger partner with other allies and partners. So it's not about us just doing more for ourselves. That's important, but it makes us also a better partner. So for us, that's a very high priority over the next few months.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, sir. Ambassador Koji, in August, the People's Republic of China fired missiles into Japan's EEZ. In October, the DPRK fired missiles over Japan. Beyond the diplomatic condemnations, is there an additional role that Japan can see for NATO engagement to deter aggression by the PRC and the DPRK?
Well, thank you very much for reminding me that we live in a rough neighborhood. But if you reflect on these events, before talking about possible cooperation with the NATO, it's obvious that we ourselves should make greater efforts to upgrade our deterrent and responsive capabilities. And that's exactly what we've been doing. Like Australia, Prime Minister Kishida has launched a defense review, comprehensive defense review. And at the end of this process, you're going to see a much more robust defense efforts on the part of Japan, including the investment in defense. Also, we've been working very closely with the United States to strengthen further our alliance efforts in the maintenance of peace and stability in the region. And that said, in terms of a question, I think I better break down my answer into DPRK and China, because these two issues are challenges, very different ballgame. As far as DPRK is concerned, without downgrading the seriousness of the challenge, the DPRK's threat is pretty much one-dimensional and well-defined. Revolving around their nuclear and missile program. So I think the trilateral collaboration, solidarity among the US, Japan, US and ROK remains the main instrument of the deterrence, I guess. But that said, I think NATO members can be helpful in two respects. First, they can be part of robust international pressures to dissuade DPRK from taking further provocative actions. For instance, strict enforcement of sanction regime, the key aspect of these efforts. And we welcome, for instance, the participation of British, French, and German navies in maritime policing operations in the region, and we look forward to continuing this sort of collaboration. The second area, NATO members may be able to provide additional avenues for diplomatic engagement. If a diplomatic process is resuscitated in the future, although the prospect remains remote, given DPRK's continued intransigence coupled with the pandemic-induced breakdown in communication. But some NATO members have diplomatic representation in North Korea, so that can be helpful if the process is needed. China, on the other hand, is a completely different ballgame. The challenges posed by China are multidimensional, unlike the one posed by the DPRK. And China is also the world's second largest economy, deeply integrated into the global economy. So that is reason why we talk about the three C's of confrontation, competition, and cooperation in our approach to that country. So the main challenge is how we go about finding an appropriate balance among those components. And in that respect, I'm happy to see a greater convergence of views with our European partners in this respect in recent years. In concrete terms, NATO's contribution can encompass broad areas from diplomacy to economic security. And I think time is too short to elaborate these contributions. But as he faces an increasingly uncertain future in our relation with China in the wake of the recent political developments in Beijing, we do look forward to deepening our conversation with NATO members so as to ensure coherence and consistency in our respective approach toward the country.
Excellent. Thank you very much, sir. Ambassador Corry, so in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, your country has deployed personnel to NATO territory and provided direct assistance to Ukraine itself. Can you envision any scenarios in which a NATO member state might deploy personnel and provide military assistance to the Asia-Pacific region? And if I may just follow on with asking, do you see any such potential deployments occurring under a national flag, or could a NATO-led operation occur?
Thank you. New Zealand has indeed made a set of contributions to Ukraine. We've been making contributions to the security of Europe, after all, for over 100 years. And we have been, in respect of Ukraine, conducting infantry training, artillery training, and providing our partners in NATO with logistics as well as intelligence support and funding through the NATO Trust Fund. In terms of NATO's engagement as an alliance, so NATO qua NATO in the region, the circumstances in which that would happen and how that would happen are really a matter for NATO and how a NATO member interpreted the relevant security obligation. And I'm hesitant to enter the risky waters of hypotheticals by prescribing the circumstances in which NATO as an alliance would engage in the region. for reasons I think you'll all understand. But in terms of NATO members actively engaging in the region, I think as we've heard this morning, this is something that is already happening. It is something we actively welcome, and it's something we are warmly engaging with. The United States clearly plays a vital role in the security of the Indo-Pacific, and we are richly engaged there. The UK, as I've mentioned, is a very important contributor to regional security. I've mentioned the carrier group last year, but also a variety of other security engagements and commitments, including the presence of offshore patrol vessels in the region. France is an important NATO member with an important and enduring presence in the Pacific, one that works closely with Australia and New Zealand militaries on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief through the FRANZ mechanism. Germany, I think, recently sent Air Force fighters and personnel for a recent regional exercise in Australia, and a whole variety of NATO partners and the countries represented on this table this morning, of course, play a significant role through the deployment of military assets and the monitoring of compliance with the DPRK sanctions regime. So a lot of this, flag-based activity is already happening, and it's really important and something we welcome.
Thank you for that. Ambassador Cho, South Korea's defense industry has gained a prominent position internationally, particularly given the recent historic Hanwha deal with Poland and other potential deals with NATO customers, and also some media reporting that came out late last week. I'd be interested in hearing your perspective on, beyond obviously the commercial aspects of this, what does this portend for ROK foreign and security policies vis-a-vis Europe and elsewhere, also within the context of President Yoon's vision of a global pivot state?
Global pivot state is catchphrase and the central concept that defines President Yoon Suk-yeol's foreign policies. That's important. It means that we're going to be more active globally and regionally, and not really being confined in the Korean Peninsula too much. That's the concept, and that will entail a lot of, I think, concrete policy changes and different policy emphases. About your question, Heino, yes, our defense industry was successful in having some substantial contracts about defense industry with Poland and a couple of other countries, but these countries are not in Europe, actually. The members of NATO are not in Europe. So when it comes to European countries where the Korean defense industries becoming a little more attractive potential suppliers, is actually Poland, only one country. So I think it's probably a little too early to put this aspect into the whole foreign and security policy implications metrics. So I think it's premature, really. But I would say that the defense industries have developed in my countries because two reasons. One is that the overall industrial capabilities have developed over the years. And secondly, of course, we have an adversary as our neighbor. So our defense industries were kind of more motivated to hone their skills and develop their acumen and come up with a better and more capable equipment. And some of them have found a potential customers these days. But this is kind of maybe 2 or 3 year affair. So we'll have to see what's going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years, I think.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Cho. We've got a little under 30 minutes for Q&A. So what I would ask is, when you're called upon, please introduce yourself briefly, ask a question briefly, so we get more people an opportunity. And I think we have somebody with a microphone, correct? So let's just start right here in the front.
Hi, thanks so much for doing this. This is So-Young Kim from Radio Free Asia. About North Korea, I have 2 questions. You probably saw the recent news that U.S. government publicly announced that they found an indication that North Korea was sending some artilleries to Russia. that can be used in Ukraine war. I'm wondering if you have any own assessment on that and any comments. And my second question is, I believe that not only South Korea and Japan, but Australia and New Zealand are other member countries that monitor illicit activities in the waters, the ship-to-ship transfer by North Korea, the sanctions evasion. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the recent progress and if there is any future plan to possibly intensify, because it seems like it's hard to change the North Korea's course of the provocation. Thank you.
And who are you addressing those questions to?
Anyone?
Okay, we'll take some volunteers then. Ambassador Cho, what do you think?
I think it's time to pay for
Just on, thanks. I mean, I'll sort of quickly address the last aspect, which is interdiction on the high seas and whatever. Obviously, that remains a priority for all of us because of the activities that we pick up, drugs and other activities that are going on. That's ongoing. I don't know that I've been advised that there's a particular increase in the tempo, but it's very clear that those activities continue to occur and that it's important for them to be monitored and cut off wherever possible. Can I just say on the whole Korean thing, obviously from an Australian perspective, it is a priority given that the strong relationship we have with both Korea, Republic of Korea, and with Japan, that there is a way found to try and cauterize this, because it can be very destabilizing for all of us. And recent activities have only highlighted the importance of seeking to address this, but it is very hard to address because frankly, as my final comment on this, the only card North Korea really has to play is this, and it's very hard for them to give that up, because once they give that up, they have no leverage. So this is why it's such a wicked problem, as we call it.
Do you have anything?
Well, as for your first question, I don't have any privileged information as to what's taking place between North Korea and Russia, although we remain vigilant, what's happening in that area. As far as interdiction operations concerned, I think they remain very important and we continue with these efforts. But more broadly, I think we are mindful that the recent, very frequent missile launchings may lead to different level of provocation on the part of North Korea, including nuclear testing. And if that happens, I think we in national society needs to step up our actions against that country, including in New York. So we look forward to continue our discussion with the like-minded countries, particularly those 4 countries that we represented here.
Thank you.
nothing to add.
Okay.
About the first question, the possibility of North Korea providing arms to Russia. We have a kind of ground rule in diplomacy. So this is being said by only one government, that is U.S. government. So I think this question would have to be directed to U.S. government. All the other governments didn't say anything about this. So following this diplomatic and decorum, I shouldn't say anything to add to this. But this is a very serious information, and I think all of us will have to really pursue if this possibility is actually true, because that is these implications. I would say that hugely important, because there are 10 Security Council resolutions sanctioning North Korea, right? And out of 10, initially what happened was that United Nations Security Council prohibited any member of United Nations to procure arms from North Korea or sell arms to North Korea. That was the first step in a sanctions regime. That means that this is a very, very bad and negative thing to do. And the possibility that the member is not just an ordinary member, doing this, of course, has very serious implications. So I'll stop there. About your second question, interdiction is very important. The sanctions regime established by the United Nations Security Council, 10 resolutions, are very comprehensive and very important and serious. These sanctions actually have teeth, right? That's what people say. But teeth, as long as these sanctions are being implemented faithfully. And I suspect that the sanctions implementation these days over the last couple of years is less than satisfactory. So we have a job to do. And as a matter of fact, members of the United Nations and our friends are actually trying to prevent and reduce these illegal transactions. And also, I want to add that we have this initiative called PSI, this Proliferation Security Initiative. It will mark, I think, 10 years next year. So leading up to that anniversary year, I think the partners in the initiative are trying to strengthen our efforts to make sure that proliferation-induced illegal transaction would not happen very, very much. It is not just about North Korea, but it is mostly about North Korea in the Indo-Pacific region. So this is important.
Thank you very much. I think all the countries represented here have deployed actually assets for UNSCR enforcement missions, as well as made many of our NATO partners when they've deployed to the region. So, okay, this gentleman right here. Yes.
Thank you. Tom Duffy, National War College. Thank you, Your Excellencies. A question about formal and informal security arrangements. So NATO is sort of the dictionary definition, very structured, very formal security relationship. But many of you have talked about maritime operations, and our colleague from Korea talked about counter-piracy, which was on the complete opposite side of the scale. It was just the navies getting together and deciding what to do. There was no superstructure whatsoever. So I'd be interested in your viewpoints from your nations, the attractions of very formal security arrangements like NATO versus very informal security relations like we see in the maritime operation, and especially we saw it with the counter-piracy, but given the maritime nature of the Indo-Pacific, aren't very informal security relations actually more attractive for you?
For the entire panel? Or
especially Ambassadors Corry and Cho. But
okay, please.
I think as you said, the NATO is the quintessential formal security networks. It has been there for a long time, and the partnership with NATO is an informal thing. And so informal sometimes means that you don't have the formal obligations to perform any of the duties. But at the same time, I think in some specific areas, these informal relations, the partners can actually produce a significant the outcomes. As you said, the anti-piracy operations of the coast of Horn of Africa, I think, is one example. This is, I think, it's work in progress as the AP4 countries have more a regular and more substantive dialogue with NATO countries. I think we can probably find some other areas or some other instances or some other the levels on which the AP4 countries and NATO countries can actually collaborate for the good of the whole partners involved. So this is kind of abstract answer because I don't see not many concrete things are happening at the moment, but there is certainly a potential for more operations like this, and that will be beneficial to all of us.
Thanks very much for the question. I suppose just to supplement what the ambassador has said, I suppose military alliances are relatively hard won and complex things to achieve. And they are not always amenable to being applied to things that are more situational or of the moment. For instance, anti-piracy, and there are a variety of other areas where you see more ad hoc security arrangements or systems in play. But I think it is a little more complex than, as you put it, the Navy simply getting together. Most of those kind of security operations will come with government mandates and limits and caveats and systems and frameworks. It's horses for courses. Each is a valid response to a given set of situations. Military alliances tend, I guess, by way of generalization, to have a broad strategic application and resonance, and ad hoc coalitions that are willing tend often to be at the sub-strategic level, not always.
Thank you. Yes, right here. Actually, one row behind.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Lynn Kwok, and I'm the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Asia Pacific Security. Thank you very much for your excellent remarks. I had two questions. The first one was directed to Ambassador Koji. Your Prime Minister at the Shangri-La Dialogue said, warned that if it was Ukraine today, it might be East Asia next. And of course, the allusion there was that China might well
Don't worry about it. It's just
attack Taiwan if, you know, Russia were allowed to get away with Ukraine. What was the linkage in your Prime Minister's mind, or what was the linkage in Japan's mind? Is it that authoritarian states are more likely to attack other states than, say, democratic ones, or was it a broader reasoning around the rules-based order? My second question is directed to anyone in the panel who would like to address it. And that's to do with engagement and difficulties in terms of your respective countries' engagement with Southeast Asia. Now, the Biden administration has put Southeast Asia at the heart of its Indo-Pacific strategy. Your respective countries have also recognized the importance of Southeast Asia. Despite such engagement, it's quite clear that the perceptions of threat in Southeast Asia are not quite the same. So, for instance, the Malaysian defense minister at the Shangri-La Dialogue mentioned 4 strategic challenges for his country. None of them was strategic competition, nor was it about China. And the Indonesian defense minister actually was quite happily talking about how Asia has always managed its problems well and would continue to do so. Thank you very much. How do you see that as posing difficulties for your respective countries' engagement in the region, or is coordinated or joint efforts to maintain the rules-based order less your concern and more about ensuring that Southeast Asian countries do not fall into China's camp? Thank you.
Mr. Koji, do you want to start?
Well, thank you very much. The first question, I think what the Prime Minister said was, I think it's based on his broad concern about the future of international order. If you allow somebody to unilaterally change the status quo with impunity, the rule-based order will be broken if that trend continues. Of course, his concern is based on increasing the difficult security environment. I'm not going to name names, but that's the background to his statement. But his main focus is his concern over the international order. On the second question, I think it's an excellent question, because when we talk about strategic competition, we tend to conjure up image. There are the two camps divided, one liberal democracy and the authoritarian. But the reality is quite different, because we have a vast countries in between, what we start calling the global South. And Southeast Asia is among those group of countries. So we have to respect that. And but at the same time, I think we need to make efforts to broaden, strengthen the community of nations sharing values and principles. So that's the reason why we've been trying to engage those countries. We are encouraging the United States to reach out to those countries, and I very much heartened by the U.S. efforts to reach out to the Southeast Asia through IPEF, for instance, reaching out to the Pacific Island countries. Those initiatives, and of course, Quad is another example. So try to create the community of nations sharing values. I mean, we sometimes we use the term free and open in the Pacific. That's the same thing. So this will remain an important priority over diplomatic efforts.
Thank you. Anyone else that wanted to address?
Just quickly on Southeast Asia. I mean, the new government has put even more emphasis on our relations with Southeast Asia. And we're not asking them to choose. We're not saying they've got to go on the ramparts and they say, which side are you on or anything like that. What we're about, and my friend Ambassador Koji referred to this, it's about giving them choices. And that means being engaged with them. That's why we were very keen for the US to promote the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework as a way of greater trade and economic engagement in the region. And that gives countries in the region greater choice. And I think the other point that we consistently make about Australian policy, in particularly in Southeast Asia, is we talk about ASEAN centrality, that we're not seeking to supplant the institutions in the region. We seek to work with those institutions. But in doing so, we're giving them choices. And I think while they may not say this explicitly, they value the fact that we give them choices because it enhances their own sovereignty. And that's basically the bottom line for us.
Can I just
Please.
one point? I talked about engagement, but the important thing is engagement needs to be supported by tangible benefit. So, you know, as we try to engage Southeast Asia, for instance, we also have to make sure that our engagement can bring about tangible benefits. That's the reason why IPEF is so important. That's the reason why, for instance, in the context of Quad, we are doing vaccination cooperation, practical cooperation. So engagement has to go hand in hand with the tangible benefits.
Yeah,
Please.
well, ASEAN, the ROK and ASEAN established dialogue partnership in, I think, 1989. So it's been over 30 years. And Australia and Japan, I'm sure, established the same, and New Zealand too, probably earlier than Korea. And ASEAN, I believe that this one, I think ASEAN is the most successful group of nations, a regional grouping that exists today, because ASEAN has a huge convening power. And also ASEAN has a substantial consensus building power. For example, when you talk about, say, issues like when you talk about, say, Indo-Pacific strategy, different countries have different emphases. So different countries, I mean, all countries can refer to one document, and that is a document adopted by ASEAN. So what I'm saying is that ASEAN has this capability to come up with a consensus reflected kind of document, and naturally sometimes not very specific, but otherwise it's a kind of reference, kind of consensus or document that can be accepted by probably all in the Indo-Pacific region. So I really appreciate this capability of ASEAN, and that should remain. Having said that, since ASEAN is so middle of the road on the consensus building, and ASEAN also has diversity among ASEAN nations, so it's difficult to sometimes come up with a strong kind of one position. So that's why I think ASEAN not very often works as a one voting bloc, for example, in the UN community. So we have to recognize the strength of ASEAN, and strength mostly but there are some challenges within ASEAN and also dealing with us.
Very briefly, your question is sprouting lots of answers from the panel, but I would simply say that when we think about security or military engagement with Southeast Asia, it's not with a view to predetermining what their strategic priority should be. That is a matter for them, but it is absolutely a means of helping to build their resilience and habits of cooperation between us. And so I wouldn't kind of overly problematize the issue, because certainly what we find, whether it is our bilateral assistance through the New Zealand Defence Force or whether it's through regional fora, 5-power defence agreement is one vector. The ADM Plus is clearly another. We don't seem to, face any particularly significant challenges in operating with our Southeast Asian partners. It's a very welcome, and to pick up the word used by my Korean colleague earlier, mutually beneficial set of arrangements.
Thank you very much. How about this gentleman back here? Yeah.
Thank you, Rick Weir with IMSAR. Question, Ambassador Koji, I think you touched it quite nicely when you talked about interoperability as being a requirement. One might say that a product of interoperability is information sharing, which is going quite well with Ukraine. We share information, we share intelligence. Five Eyes does a fairly good job of that. The trilateral with Japan and Korea might be able to do a little better in the future. For each of you, with respect to interoperability and its product intelligence and information sharing, where do you see areas of improvement that we might someday address a problem like Taiwan?
All right, we'll stick with alphabetical order.
I'll abstract from Taiwan for a second, because that can take you right through another rabbit hole. But what we're doing, for example, in the context of AUKUS, is we have the Five Eyes intelligence sharing arrangements. They're going pretty well, and if anything, they're getting deeper and more sophisticated and more complex. In the AUKUS context, what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a greater integration between the Australia, UK, and US industrial bases, national technology industrial base. Both countries were declared part of the base as part of an act that Senator McCain sponsored in about 2017. But this is about how do you make it real? How do, for example, international trafficking in arms regulations apply in this context, export controls, all the things that potentially inhibit tech transfer? Because the ultimate goal here is industrial integration as part of a greater interchangeability between the three forces and the platforms that they use. We don't just do it in that context, but we are using AUKUS as a bit of a Trojan horse to break down some of those barriers. And I've no doubt you're very familiar with them. We're also standing up for sovereign capability in precision guided munitions. We want to use the same approach to break down some of the barriers to cooperation because of the tech that the US in particular brings to the table. Our view is that if the US is prepared to share its crown jewels, its nuclear Navy secrets, then they've got to be prepared to trust us in terms of the information sharing, the tech transfer that comes with that. And so we're working with the administration and also with the Congress about how we make that more of a reality.
Sir.
Yeah, I think we are starting to see an increasing number of instances where military technology development requires multilateral platform. F-35 is a case in point. So nowadays, I think the technology we require is so advanced. I think it's important for the like-minded countries to bring together expertise, technology, and so on and so forth. So I think we are going to see a lot of the cases involving multilateral countries. But in order to make sure that trend continues, I think there are several enablement environments that have to be fulfilled in each participant. Like as I mentioned, in the case of Japan, I think we have traditional weakness in, for instance, information security. So that's something we've been working on. But I think there's a definite trend for multilateral cooperation in that area, which leads to, I think, greater interoperability.
Excellent, thank you. Corry.
In the interest of time, and not to evade the question, I'll be really brief. as I understand the question, it's really about what are the gaps that we need to fill as we think about intelligence sharing and information cooperation. I'd simply make two probably blindingly self-evident points. One is that the threatscape is rapidly changing, and the other is that technology is rapidly advancing, and the advancing technology is also part of the changing threatscape. Staying ahead of those two things is I think the great challenge between partners, and it's obviously the smaller you are, the bigger the challenge it is.
Well, until very recently, ROK shared intelligence and information with only one country, and our sole treaty ally, that's United States. So bilateral intelligence sharing has been going on for decades. And we haven't ventured out of that for quite a while until very recently. Recently, we have had something new in the trilateral nature. So the Korea, Japan, United States have been conducting trilateral security cooperation and trilateral exercises. That includes missile warning exercises, ballistic missile, the tracking exercises, anti-submarine exercises, to name a few. And actually, last week in Phnom Penh, the three leaders met and came up with a rather substantive joint statement. I think the first joint document that came out of trilateral summit meeting. In that, there is a paragraph that said that the three leaders agree to pursue the sharing missile warning data in real time among three countries. So we have this. We'll have to flesh it out. But I think this is a rather important agreement out of the trilateral summit meeting, and that probably expand the horizon of intelligence information sharing with Japan. And as you know, some of you may know that we have things to do, things to work out between Korea and Japan always. And one of them was the information sharing bilateral agreement called Jisonia. And that still is kind of on the table as an issue. But now that we have a broader agreement, three leaders agreeing to share missile warning data in real time. So I think that we are going into a uncharted territories here in a very good way, I think. So we are going to do a much more information sharing between bilateral, also trilateral in the future.
Well, on that note, I think we're going to have to end, respectful of Your Excellency's time. Again, let me thank you all for sharing your morning with a large audience. Thank you to the audience again for your questions. I will tell you that I think you can tell a lot about a person by the company he or she keeps. I think that is also applicable to countries. So I'm particularly proud of America's bilateral relationship with each of the countries that you represent here in Washington. But I also think that your growing relationship with NATO is reflective of the alliance and its values and interests, as well as your own country. So if I could ask everybody to please join us and thank you very much.